I never thought I'd end up working the night shift at McDonald's, but life has a funny way of putting you exactly where you don't want to be. The job market was rough, rent was due, and I was desperate. So, when I saw the now hiring sign flickering in the dim glow of the streetlights, I didn't hesitate. I walked in, filled out an application, and within a week, I had my uniform, my name tag, and a key to the front door. The first red flag should have been how quickly they hired me. The second should have been the way the manager, a gaunt, sleep-deprived man named Charlie, looked at me when he handed me the employee handbook. He hesitated for a moment before speaking. "You'll be working the graveyard shift," he said, scratching at the stubble on his chin. "It's usually quiet. Just follow the rules, and you'll be fine." I nodded. Seemed simple enough. But then he slid a separate piece of paper across the counter. It wasn't part of the official handbook. The paper was old, creased, and covered in smudges. The title at the top read, "Night Shift Rules." I frowned. "Is this, like, extra guidelines or something?" Charlie exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. "Yeah, let's call it that." I glanced over the list. The first few seemed reasonable, if a bit odd. Always keep the front door locked between 2 o'clock and 4 a.m. No exceptions. If the drive-through speaker crackles but no one's there, ignore it. Do not, under any circumstances, enter the back storage room after 2 a.m. If a man in a blue hoodie knocks on the window, do not engage. Do not acknowledge him. I snorted. "This a joke?" Charlie didn't laugh. "You'll see." He left it at that, showing me the basics, how to work the register, where we kept the extra fries, the trick to unclogging the soda machine when it inevitably decided to rebel. Everything about the store seemed normal enough, except for the lingering feeling that I was stepping into something I didn't understand. By the time my first night shift rolled around, I was more annoyed than nervous. Rules or no rules, I figured the worst thing I'd deal with would be drunk customers demanding nuggets at 3 a.m. I could handle that. I arrived at 11:45 p.m. Charlie was already halfway out the door, tossing me the keys. "See you in the morning," he muttered, without making eye contact. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving me alone in the dimly lit restaurant. The first few hours were uneventful. A few late-night stragglers came in, mostly college kids and truckers. I kept the fryer running, made a few Big Macs, and mindlessly scrolled through my phone when things got quiet. Then, at exactly 1:58 a.m., the drive-through speaker crackled. Static. No voices. No cars in sight. I froze, my eyes flicking to the rule sheet taped beside the register. Rule number 2, if the drive-through speaker crackles but no one's there, ignore it. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the intercom button. Maybe it was just a glitch. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe. Another crackle. Then a faint whisper, just beyond comprehension. I swallowed hard and stepped back. Ignore it. Just ignore it. The static continued for another 30 seconds before cutting off abruptly. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. I shook my head. Just my imagination. At 2:10 a.m., someone knocked on the window. Slow. Rhythmic. 3 precise taps. A chill ran down my spine as I turned toward the glass. There, standing just outside, was a man in a blue hoodie. His face was obscured by the shadow of his hood, but I could feel his gaze. Watching. Waiting. My stomach twisted. Rule number 4, if a man in a blue hoodie knocks on the window, do not engage. Do not acknowledge him. I tore my eyes away, pretending I hadn't seen him. My hands trembled as I focused on wiping down the counter, anything to keep myself busy. The knocks came again. And again. Each tap sent a spike of dread through me. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the knocking stopped. I exhaled, my breath shaky. When I finally dared to glance back at the window, the man was gone. The rest of the night dragged on, but nothing else happened. By the time 6 a.m. rolled around, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed. Charlie arrived at 6:15, giving me a once-over before gnawing. "You made it," he said simply. He didn't need to elaborate. I knew exactly what he meant. I should have quit then and there. But I didn't. Because curiosity is a dangerous thing. And I had questions that needed answers. I should have walked away after that first shift. I should have handed in my uniform, told Charlie I wasn't cut out for this, and found a job that didn't come with an instruction manual straight out of a horror movie. But I didn't. Rent wasn't going to pay itself, and part of me, a very stupid part, wanted to see if that night had been some kind of elaborate prank. I convinced myself that maybe I'd been overreacting. Maybe I had let exhaustion and the eerie stillness of the empty restaurant get to me. The human mind is funny like that. It tries to rationalize what it doesn't understand, even when every instinct is screaming that something is wrong. The second night started off even quieter than the first. No customers. No weird noises. Just me, a stack of frozen fries, and the monotonous hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Midnight rolled around, and I started to think that maybe the first night had been a fluke. Then the cameras glitched. One moment, the screens displayed the empty dining area and parking lot. The next, static. A burst of white noise filled the air, making me jump. I turned to the monitor just in time to see a single frame flicker into existence. The man in the blue hoodie, standing in the drive-thru lane, facing the camera. His hood still obscured his face, but this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him, barely visible in the shadows, were others. Figures standing motionless, their outlines blurred by the distortion. Then the screen cut to static again. My pulse pounded in my ears. My first instinct was to run to the door and make sure it was locked. It was. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I glanced at the rule sheet. Nothing about multiple figures. Just the man in the blue hoodie. Did that mean I should ignore them too? The drive-thru speaker crackled to life. More static. Then a voice, hollow and distant. "Help us." I stepped back, my fingers gripping the edge of the counter. My gut told me not to respond. That whatever was on the other end of that speaker wasn't looking for help. The static faded, leaving behind a suffocating silence. I stood frozen, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Minutes passed. The cameras remained down. The restaurant was dead silent. Then the knocking started. Not from the front window. Not from the drive-thru. From the back storage room. Rule number 3, do not, under any circumstances, enter the back storage room after 2 a.m. I checked the clock. 2:07 a.m. The knocking continued, slow and deliberate. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to breathe. This was a test. It had to be. If I followed the rules, I'd be fine. Another knock, louder this time. I backed away, keeping my eyes on the door. Whatever was behind it wasn't going to get an answer from me. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed felt even heavier than before, like the air itself was waiting for me to slip up. I didn't. I stayed rooted to the spot, barely daring to blink. At 3 a.m., the cameras came back online. Everything was exactly as it should have been. The dining area was empty. The parking lot was still. The figures were gone. But the man in the blue hoodie wasn't. He stood in the exact same spot, facing the camera, his head tilted ever so slightly. Watching. Waiting. I didn't move until the first rays of sunlight crept through the windows. Only then did I let myself breathe again. Charlie showed up at 6:15, same as before. He took one look at me and sighed. "You saw them, didn't you?" I nodded. He rubbed his temples. "Yeah. They're getting bolder." "Where are they?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Charlie hesitated, then shook his head. "Doesn't matter. Just follow the rules." I wanted to push for more answers, but something in his expression told me it wouldn't do any good. So I swallowed my questions, handed over my keys, and walked out into the morning light, my head buzzing with everything I had seen. I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just a job anymore. It was survival. I barely slept after my second shift. The images from the security cameras burned themselves into my brain, those shadowy figures standing behind the man in the blue hoodie, the way they just disappeared. And then, of course, the knocking from the back storage room. What would have happened if I had opened the door? I didn't want to find out. But I also knew that I wasn't going to quit. Not yet. I needed answers. The next night, I arrived at McDonald's at 11:45 p.m., the same as before. Charlie was already outside, leaning against his car, arms crossed. He looked more exhausted than usual, dark circles beneath his eyes. "You're back," he muttered. Not a question. A statement. I nodded. I need to know what's going on here. Charlie sighed, rubbing his face. "You're better off not knowing." That's not an answer. For a moment, I thought he refused to tell me anything. But then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. He handed it to me, and when I unfolded it, I saw a single sentence written in shaky handwriting. The back room wasn't always there. I looked up at Charlie, but he was already walking away. "Wait," I called after him. "What does that mean?" He didn't turn around. "You'll figure it out. Just follow the damn rules." And with that, he drove off, leaving me standing in the dim glow of the parking lot lights, my skin crawling with unease. The first couple of hours were uneventful, as usual. A handful of late-night customers, a drunk guy who tried to pay for his meal with a handful of buttons, the usual. The security cameras were working fine this time. No sign of the man in the blue hoodie. No whispering from the drive-thru. For a brief moment, I thought maybe tonight would be normal. Then, at exactly 2:03 a.m., the knocking started again. I turned to face the back room door, my heart pounding in my chest. Slow, deliberate knocks. 3 of them. I didn't move. Didn't breathe. Just stood frozen, waiting for the noise to stop. Then something changed. The door handle rattled. I stumbled back, nearly knocking over a stack of trays. The rule sheet flashed through my mind. Rule number 3, do not, under any circumstances, enter the back storage room after 2 a.m. I wasn't planning on it. But whatever was on the other side of that door, it wanted out. The rattling continued, more insistent now. The door wasn't locked. I had no reason to lock it earlier, but something was keeping it shut. Something was stopping it from opening. A low scraping noise came from the other side, like nails dragging across wood. I backed away until I hit the counter. My breath was coming in short gasps, my hands shaking. Then, as suddenly as it had started, everything went silent. The door stopped rattling. The scraping noise faded. The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating. I waited. A full minute. 2. Then, against every ounce of common sense in my body, I took a step forward. I didn't touch the door, didn't try to open it. But I leaned in just enough to hear if anything was still there. Silence. Then, right as I was about to turn away, something whispered my name. Not from inside the back room. From the intercom. I spun around so fast I nearly tripped over my own feet. The drive-thru speaker crackled with static. A voice, distorted and distant, barely audible. "Come back." I swallowed hard, staring at the speaker as if it would somehow explain itself. Then the cameras glitched. Every screen flickered, showing nothing but static except one. The feed from the back storage room. The screen showed the inside of the room, dimly lit by the flickering overhead light. The usual supplies were there, stacks of frozen burger patties, bags of fries, cleaning supplies. Everything seemed normal, except for the figure standing in the middle of the room. It wasn't facing the camera. It stood perfectly still, its head tilted slightly to one side. The longer I stared, the more I realized something was wrong with its proportions. Its arms were too long. Its fingers, too sharp. Then, Slowly, it began to turn toward the camera. The feed cut to static. I slammed my hand down on the power button, shutting the monitors off completely. My entire body was trembling. I needed to get out of here. But the shift wasn't over. The rules said nothing about leaving early. And something told me that breaking the rules would be worse than anything waiting inside that room. So I waited. I forced myself to breathe, to focus on the task at hand. Cleaning, stocking, doing anything other than thinking about the thing I had just seen on the camera. At 5:57 a.m., something thumped against the back door one last time. A slow, deliberate knock. Then silence. When the sun finally rose, I grabbed my things and practically ran outside. Charlie was already there, leaning against his car like he'd been waiting for me. "Did you see it?" he asked. I nodded, still too shaken to speak. Charlie exhaled, rubbing his temples. They always show themselves to the new ones first. "What the hell is in that room?" I finally managed to ask. He didn't answer right away. Then, finally, he said, "Like I told you before, it wasn't always there." I wanted to press for more, but I could tell from the look on his face that I wouldn't get any answers. Not yet. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't quitting. Not until I knew the truth. I walked into my fourth shift with a growing sense of unease. I had already seen things that defied logic, heard whispers where no one should have been speaking, and felt the suffocating presence of something lurking just out of sight. Yet, despite everything, I still wasn't ready to walk away. Maybe it was the need for answers. Maybe it was plain stupidity. Charlie was waiting for me by the counter when I arrived. He had a piece of paper in his hand, different from the ones before. He didn't greet me. He just handed it over and said they added a new rule. My stomach dropped. I unfolded the paper and scanned the text. The first few rules remained the same: the locked doors, the blue-hooded man, the drive-through voices, and, of course, the storage room. But at the bottom of the list, written in red ink, was something new. 5. If you hear the phone ring after 3:33 a.m., do not answer it. I looked up at Charlie. Who added this? His expression was grim. Same people who made the first list. I frowned. And that would be? Charlie sighed. No one knows. The list has been here longer than I have. He didn't wait for any more questions. He just patted my shoulder and left. I was alone again. The night started off uneventfully, much like the others. A few late-night customers came through, mostly truckers and college kids too exhausted to realize the strangeness of this place. Midnight passed, and I tried to keep my mind occupied with routine tasks. At 1:57 a.m., the drive-through speaker crackled. I ignored it. I was learning. At 2:10 a.m., the blue-hooded man appeared at the window. I ignored him, too. At 2:45 a.m., something scratched at the back storage room door. I kept my distance. Then, at exactly 3:33 a.m., the phone rang. A chill ran down my spine. The phone was an old landline mounted on the wall near the register. I hadn't even realized it was plugged in. I had never seen it ring before. The rule was clear: do not answer it. The ringing continued, sharp and shrill, in the empty restaurant. It cut through the silence like a knife, setting my nerves on edge. I stepped back, pressing my hands against my ears. It rang again, and again, and again. Then it stopped. The silence was worse. I exhaled shakily and lowered my hands. I turned back toward the counter and froze. The receiver was off the hook. It lay on the counter, the cord stretched taut, as if someone had answered it without my knowing. A soft, raspy voice whispered from the speaker. "We see you." I stumbled backward, knocking into a chair. The voice on the line didn't sound human. It was layered, distorted, like multiple voices speaking in unison. Then the line went dead. I stood there, my breath coming in short gasps, staring at the dangling receiver. My hands were trembling. I had followed the rule. I hadn't answered the phone, but it had answered itself. The camera monitors flickered. One by one, they all went dark except for one. The back storage room feed remained. The dim, flickering light illuminated the space. And in the center of the room stood a figure. Not the man in the blue hoodie. Not one of the shadowy figures I had seen before. This one was different. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs stretched beyond normal proportions. Its head was tilted unnaturally to one side, and where its face should have been, there was only darkness. It lifted a single, elongated hand and pointed directly at the camera. My blood ran cold. Then the screen went black. I don't remember the rest of the shift. I must have gone through the motions, cleaning, closing things down, keeping my head down until sunrise. When Charlie arrived, he took one look at me and sighed. "You heard it, didn't you?" he asked. I nodded. He rubbed his temples. "You followed the rule?" "Yes." Charlie looked relieved, but only slightly. "Good. Then you're still okay. For now." I swallowed hard. "What happens if someone answers?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "No one's ever lived long enough to tell us." I stared at him. He didn't look like he was joking. Charlie clapped a hand on my shoulder. "Get some rest, kid. You're going to need it." As I walked out into the early morning light, I realized something terrifying. The rules weren't just warnings. They were a lifeline. And something was trying to cut the rope. By the time my fifth shift rolled around, I had stopped questioning whether or not I should keep coming back. At this point, I needed to know. I needed to understand what was happening in this McDonald's, what these rules were protecting me from, and more importantly, what was waiting for me in the shadows. Charlie wasn't there to greet me this time. No warnings, no new rules, no cryptic messages scribbled on a piece of paper. Just the hum of the fluorescent lights and the greasy smell of fries that had been sitting out too long. The first 2 hours of my shift passed in relative silence. A few customers trickled in, mostly truckers and college kids looking for a late-night bite. I took their orders, kept my head down, and followed the rules. No eye contact with the man in the blue hoodie. No acknowledging the whispers over the intercom. No looking at the security feed for too long. Then, at exactly 2:15 a.m., the bell above the door chimed. A man walked in. He was tall, painfully thin, with skin so pale it almost seemed translucent under the dim lighting. He was dressed in an old-fashioned black suit, the kind you expect to see in grainy photographs from the 1920s. His eyes were sunken, dark voids that seemed to absorb the light around him. But the strangest thing of all? He walked straight to table 9 and sat down. There was something about table 9. I hadn't paid much attention to it before, but now that I thought about it, I couldn't remember ever seeing anyone sit there. Even during the busier hours, the other employees seemed to avoid wiping it down or setting trays too close to it. Like it wasn't really there. Like it wasn't meant to be used. And now, this man was sitting at it, staring directly at me. I swallowed hard. "Can I get you something?" His lips curled into a thin, unsettling smile. "You already know what I want." I didn't. But I wasn't about to say that. I forced a nod, turned on my heel, and walked back behind the counter, pretending to check the register screen. My hands were shaking. I could still feel his eyes on me, piercing, unblinking. I glanced at the cameras. The feed from the dining area showed all the other tables. But table 9? It was empty. I looked back up. The man was still there. A sharp ringing sound shattered the silence. The phone. The one mounted on the wall by the drive-thru station. I knew the rule. Rule number 5. If you hear the phone ring after 3:33 a.m., do not answer it. I checked the clock. 3:32 a.m. My heart pounded in my chest. I stared at the phone as it rang again, the sound growing more urgent, more insistent. My hand twitched, instinct telling me to pick it up, to make it stop. Then, from behind me, the man at table 9 spoke. If you answer that call, you won't make it to sunrise. I turned to face him, my blood running cold. What? The phone stopped ringing. Silence filled the restaurant. He tilted his head. They're testing you. I didn't know who they were. I didn't want to ask. Instead, I took a slow step forward. What do you want? His smile widened. I'm here for my order. I glanced at the register screen. It was blank. No new orders had come in. I don't see anything. You will. And then, right before my eyes, an order popped up on the screen. Table 9, 1 black coffee. The air in the restaurant turned freezing cold. My breath came out in invisible puffs as I numbly reached for the coffee pot, my hands trembling as I poured the steaming liquid into a cup. I placed it on a tray and hesitated. Then, moving slowly, I walked over to table 9 and set it down in front of him. He looked down at it, then back up at me. Thank you. I turned to walk away. Wait. I stopped. He reached into the pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out something small, placing it on the table. A single, old-fashioned brass key. For when the time comes, he said. I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't want to know. Instead, I took the key, my fingers brushing against the freezing metal, and backed away. When I looked up again, the man was gone. The coffee sat untouched. And table 9 was empty once more. After the man at table 9 vanished, I could still feel the weight of the brass key in my pocket. It felt heavier than it should have, like it carried something more than just its physical form. I thought about throwing it away, but deep down, I knew that wasn't an option. He had given it to me for a reason. But what reason? The rest of my shift passed in a haze. I couldn't focus on the register, the drive-thru, or even the clock ticking down the minutes to sunrise. My eyes kept drifting to the cameras, to the empty seat at table 9, to the storage room door that had been the source of my nightmares since my first shift. When Charlie came in at 6, I barely managed to acknowledge him. He looked at me, then at the coffee cup still sitting untouched at table 9. He came, didn't he? Charlie asked, voice quiet. I nodded. And he left this. I pulled the key from my pocket and set it on the counter between us. Charlie's face darkened. That's not good. I swallowed. Who was he? Charlie exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples like a headache was forming. We call him the customer. No one knows where he came from, but he's been showing up at table 9 longer than any of us have been here. He always orders the same thing. And sometimes, he leaves something behind. I shivered. What am I supposed to do with this? Charlie hesitated. Then, almost reluctantly, he said, Did you ever notice the second lock on the storage room door? A cold knot formed in my stomach. I shook my head. Go look. Every instinct screamed at me not to, but I forced my feet to move. The storage room door looked the same as always, scratched, stained, a relic of too many years in service. But as I stepped closer, I saw it. A small, old-fashioned lock near the bottom of the door. The kind that needed a brass key. I backed away. That wasn't there before. Charlie nodded grimly. It only appears when the key does. My breath hitched. What's inside? Charlie's eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw real fear in them. I don't know, he admitted. No one does. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. The key burned in my palm. I could feel the weight of a choice pressing down on me. Do I open the lock? Or do I leave it alone and pretend none of this ever happened? I thought about the man at table 9. His eerie smile. His parting words, for when the time comes. Maybe that time was now. My fingers trembled as I fit the key into the lock. A slow, hesitant turn. A faint click. Then the door creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness inside. And something moved. The storage room door groaned as it swung open, revealing an abyss of blackness beyond its threshold. My breath caught in my throat. The McDonald's storage room wasn't supposed to be big, just a cramped space filled with extra napkins, paper cups, and cleaning supplies. But this was something else entirely. A void stretched before me, vast and unending. The weak fluorescent light from the kitchen barely penetrated it, swallowed whole as if the darkness itself were alive. My hand tightened around the brass key, its weight still lingering in my palm like an anchor tying me to reality. Behind me, Charlie exhaled sharply. "You really opened it." I turned to him, my voice barely a whisper. "What's in there?" He didn't answer. Instead, he reached behind the counter and grabbed the flashlight we kept for power outages. He flicked it on and aimed the beam inside. The light barely cut through the thick darkness, revealing only a faint outline of a corridor stretching further than it should. The walls were old, damp bricks, far older than the rest of the building. A cold draft seeped out, carrying the scent of earth and something else, something rotten. Charlie swallowed hard. "No one's ever gone in." I stared at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean no one who's gone in has ever come back." A silence stretched between us. My heart pounded against my ribs, a primal instinct screaming at me to close the door, to walk away, to forget the key, forget the customer, forget everything. But I couldn't. Not now. I took a step forward. Charlie grabbed my arm. "You don't have to do this." But I did. Because the rules had changed. Because the customer had given me the key. Because whatever was waiting inside that corridor had been waiting for someone to open the door. I pulled free of Charlie's grip and crossed the threshold. The air was heavier in the corridor, thick and oppressive. Every step I took sent echoes skittering down the unseen passage ahead. My flashlight flickered as I moved deeper, the walls damp under my fingertips. Then, I heard it. A whisper. Not from behind me. Not from the entrance. From ahead. I froze, straining to listen. The whisper came again, just a breath of sound, barely more than a vibration in the air. But this time, I could make out words. "Not supposed to be here." A chill spread through my veins. I aimed the flashlight down the hall, but the beam was weaker now, swallowed by the blackness. Then something moved. A shadow detached itself from the darkness ahead, shifting, stretching, unfolding. My breath caught as I stumbled backward, the flashlight trembling in my grip. The thing in the corridor wasn't walking, it was gliding toward me, its shape indistinct, shifting like smoke but with the presence of something solid. The whisper turned into a low, guttural hiss. "Leave." My instinct screamed at me to run. I turned on my heel and bolted, my breath ragged as I sprinted toward the light spilling from the restaurant. Behind me, I heard the whisper shift into a growl, something scraping against the brick walls as it chased me. Charlie was already holding the door open, his face pale with terror. "Move." I didn't need to be told twice. I lunged forward, crossing the threshold just as Charlie slammed the door shut behind me. The moment it clicked into place, the air changed. The oppressive weight lifted. The restaurant was normal again. Except for one thing. The brass key was gone. And so was the second lock. Charlie and I stood in silence, breathing heavily. Finally, he spoke. "It let you go." I looked at him, my hands still shaking. This time. Because deep down, I knew. Whatever was in that corridor wasn't done with me yet.